Hello, everyone. Good. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Turn off your cell phone. So I'm David Earle. I am the Dean of the College of Arts, Social Science, and Humanities. And on behalf of UWF, I would like to welcome everyone here tonight. And it's really great to see the turnout and everyone here. And especially enthused by this event because as a college and university, we really do privilege civic engagement and civil discourse. So you're going to see a great example of civil discourse tonight. So often is at university events we hold lectures, which is an expert, a scholar talking at you from his position of intellectual privilege or knowledge. Well, we don't necessarily always like to do that in our classrooms. The most dynamic classrooms are those that are vibrant discussion and argument and debate and really and discourse. So we're going to emulate that tonight. I don't always understand why we need to have lectures in public. So tonight's format is going to be discussion style, and the topic, a divisive one, really necessitates civil discourse. So events like this also illustrate civic engagement. UWF is Pensacola's university. The College of Arts, Social Science, and Humanities holds dozens of events each year. And for more information, I believe we have some QR codes spread around. So if you don't know about the events we have, please follow us on social media or elsewhere so you can learn about them. It's our pleasure and really our responsibility to engage, to meet, to reflect, and if possible, enrich the community. And that's why these events are all free and open to the public. The next event's going to be John T. Edge, who's coming on April 15th. If you don't know John T. Edge, he is a best-selling author. He is a scholar. He is a television host of True South, which is a great show about Southern culture and Southern identity, but he approaches that through food and the people who prepare food. And so it's kind of a travel show, food show, but ultimately a show about people and really the great stories that they tell. And we get there through food. That's going to be April 15th at Pensacola Little Theater. And this is going to be part of our Gulf Coast lecture series, Gulf Coast Culture series, which is a kind of brand new series that we're starting. And really, it's designed to reflect, to explore Pensacola's rich culture, rich history, really to bring people together around Pensacola's, I think, I don't want to say idiosyncratic, but really special history and in combination of people. So please keep your eye peeled for that. I hope to see you there. By the way, April 17th is the Day of Giving. You would like to continue to have these type of events. They're all free. They're all open. So come April 17th, please consider giving to the College of Arts, Social Science, and Humanities. Commercial over. And with that, I'd like to introduce David Ramsey. Professor Ramsey is the chair of the Askew Department of Government, and he is going to discuss the format, and he's going to introduce our speakers and also introduce us to the Askew series. So, David, if you will, please come on up.
Thank you, Dean Earle. It's good to see you guys here tonight. This is the last of our annual lecture series. Each year, the Department of Government hosts 3 lectures, a Constitution Day lecture in the fall, a First Amendment lecture in the spring, and then this Askew lecture somewhere in between. And I think this might be my favorite because it allows each of us in the department to take turns bringing someone in who's a scholar in our field that we can dialogue with, introduce to our students, spend time talking to in between classes and lectures. I think you guys are really in for a treat. I've seen what Dr. Popescu did with our students today and he's got some good things to say to you. I'll have more to say about our speakers in a minute, but first, let me say something about the name at the top of your programs. Reubin O'D Askew served as governor of the state from 1971 to 1979. He was the first Florida governor to serve 2 full 4-year terms in office. Though born in Oklahoma, we claim the governor as one of our own here in Pensacola because he moved here during his childhood. And because this is where he chose to set up his practice after studying law in Gainesville. Many of you know his firm, which bears such a prominent place in our skyline, Levin Papantonio. Governor Askew was a close friend of the late Fred Levin's father, David. Like so many in this area, Askew valued military service. Serving as a naval intelligence officer during the Korean War, he served in both houses of the Florida legislature, including 2 years as president pro tem of the Senate. Askew was elected in 1971 to serve as governor, winning 57% of the vote. His accomplishments in office were wide-ranging. He oversaw desegregation of public schools, put in place busing plans. He secured passage of the state's first corporate income tax and increased homestead exemptions. He oversaw the reapportionment of legislative districts following the Supreme Court's ruling in the case Reynolds versus Sims. An advocate for transparency in government, Askew secured passage of the Sunshine Amendment, an early attempt to limit the influence of dark money in Florida politics. This was the first amendment to the state constitution to be ratified by voters rather than the legislature. It was secured more than 75% of the popular vote. Askew cultivated a public reputation as a teetotaling, church-attending politician who didn't smoke, didn't cuss, and opposed gambling in all its forms. He was known by friends and adversaries as Reubin the Good. We find in Askew's record of public service a welcome example of a successful politician who did not set aside his integrity in order to secure political power. In the words of one of his political adversaries, he's established a kind of morality in office that causes the people to have faith in government. Perhaps it's for this reason that a study of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government ranked Askew as one of the 10 best American governors of the 20th century. We commemorate his legacy tonight with this topic. Now, in just a moment, I will come up to stage our speakers, but first let me tell you a bit about each of them. Try to be brief. I begin with our own Dr. Jake Shively, this year's Askew Fellow. Dr. Shively is a graduate of Indiana University and now Associate Professor of Political Science in our department. He writes and teaches on matters in diplomacy, foreign policy, grand strategy. He worked tirelessly, I can say this with firsthand knowledge, tirelessly to build the partnership that now exists between the Hal Marcus College of Science and Engineering and the College of Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities to offer jointly the new national security track in our graduate program in cybersecurity. So he spent part of his time here at UWF working in a very practical way to keep America safe from novel forms of attack. Author of several books and articles on foreign policy and American grand strategy in the Carter, Bush II, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations, including most recently, Make America First Again, Grand Strategy Analysis, and the Trump administration. Our guest this evening is Dr. Ionut Popescu, a graduate of Duke University. He comes to us from Texas State University, where he's Associate Professor of Political Science. Dr. Popescu has written 2 important books on the topic of American grand strategy. The first, Emergent Strategy and Grand Strategy, How American Presidents Succeed in Foreign Policy, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. The second, No Peer Rivals, American Grand Strategy in the Era of Great Power Competition, will be released next month by the University of Michigan Press. In addition to these books and many scholarly articles, Dr. Popescu also writes extensively in more popular outlets, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the National Interest. As if this weren't enough, Dr. Popescu also remains active as a naval intelligence officer in the Navy Reserves, and only recently returned from deployment with the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command. In brief then, We bring to you tonight two scholars who have spent decades studying and publishing on American foreign policy and American grand strategy. Tonight they will share some of their thoughts about these topics, then open the floor for questions. For those of you interested in pursuing these things in greater detail, both authors will stick around to sign copies of their books following the lecture. One final thing, and then we can begin. I want to take a moment to acknowledge this year's Askew Scholar, Anthony Roos. There he is. Okay. Mr. Roos was selected by the department from a list of our most exceptional students, and he spent this year working with Dr. Shively to prepare a paper on NATO's influence on Scandinavian cybersecurity policy. He will present this paper in a few weeks at our Student Scholar Symposium, and I've asked him to prepare this evening's first question for the speakers following their talk. So, Mr. Roos has agreed to go first, but I want to remind each of you, you also have work to do this evening. As you're listening to the speakers, I want you to think about what kinds of questions their comments sort of provoke in your own mind, and consider braving the microphone to ask your question and begin the conversation about this very important topic. Please join me now in welcoming to the podiums our two speakers this evening.
I think you got. That's the next one. I guess. Hello, Mark. One more. There you go.
All right, I guess I'll go first. Thank you all for coming here. It's great to be in Florida. I know you call yourself the Freedom State or the Free State of Florida or something. So coming from Texas, it's kind of hard to say because I feel that Texas is the home of freedom and all good things. But I have to admit that Florida has been really pushing recently. And I don't know if that's a continuation of the Governor Askew from what I heard, but definitely there's some interesting things happening in politics these days. And like David said, I have had the privilege of not just studying about grand strategy, but also serving in the U.S. military. And of course, I'm here in a very, very private capacity, so do not hold any of the things I'm about to say to represent anything related to the U.S. Military, the Navy, or anyone else. Thank you so much, Jacob, for inviting me, and thank you to all of our hosts here for organizing this wonderful event. And with that being said, I will go ahead and begin. We're going to go back and forth, and we're going to have a couple of slides and then have the other person talk. Like the format of it will be, as you will see, a very friendly debate. So we're not going to, or at least not that I planned on, not going to be very into each other. But with that being said, let me tell you a little bit about the topic of grand strategy. And you have there the book title, and I'll talk more about my book when that time comes. But first of all, I would like to introduce the topic itself of American grand strategy and a very brief introduction to what it is, why you need one, and then I'll tell you what I think is the best grand strategy for the United States in this particular time and our particular challenges going on right now in the world. And very briefly, I think of grand strategy as a state's main idea about what it wants to achieve in the world in the realm of foreign policy and national security. Oftentimes you hear of grand strategies as plans, these grand plans, containment of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the Monroe Doctrine in an earlier era, being two of the more prominent examples in US history. But I think more so than just a plan, a grand strategy is also an organizing principle that governments use to direct resources, to choose between competing priorities, and to make decisions that are coherent and they don't go in contradiction to each other. Or at least a good grand strategy would do that. And the reason why you need one, I would argue, is because the US government is a very large entity and coordination is difficult. Sometimes you've seen you have to even use Signal to do it, and then it gets you into all sorts of trouble. So if you have a grand strategy, then you don't have to talk quite as much offline with your fellow cabinet officials, and you can rely on having a common understanding to do that. Another reason why you need a grand strategy is because you need your friends and adversaries to have a sense of what you're doing, not that you're telling them your secret, but to be able to either threaten effectively or reassure your allies. And when a government follows a grand strategy, that's an easier thing to accomplish if they are aware of what are your red lines and what are the things you as an administration are most focused on. And with that being said, I would like now to talk a little bit about, can you hear me with this, or do I have to stick with the microphone? Let's talk about the environment. And by that I mean, let's talk about the world that we find ourselves in, because at the end of the day, the choice of grand strategy is intimately related to the kind of challenges and opportunities are out there. And now I'm going to get a little more into the substance of my remarks and my book. I would argue that the current environment is best characterized by great power competition, and that is something that has been in Washington parlance, if you will, as a jargon for a few years now, but I think that nevertheless it represents the most accurate description. So after 9/11, the war on terror, the challenge of Islamic terrorism represented the main way to kind of think of what would be the greatest challenge for the US government. And I think that era has given way to the great power competition era, in which it is the rise of China and to a lesser extent the problems caused by Russia and the alliance between those two great powers, which dominate the main US national security agenda. And with that being said, I'll continue referring to this great power competition, GPC, as they call it in Washington, as the main framework to understand the world that the US is operating on. So more specifically, the threat of China's rise and quest for regional and global dominance, as President Xi repeatedly stated, Asia is for Asians, and the Chinese Communist Party does not appreciate that the US Navy and the US government, by extension, has a different view of who the main military force in the Pacific theater should be. That is, I believe, the greatest threat to US national security, China's quest for regional dominance and to push the US Navy out and sever our alliances, and more specifically defending Taiwan and maintaining the sea lanes of communication in South China Sea. I see those two as the most important priorities for the US military in the Asian theater. And secondly, I'm going to talk less about that, but be happy to elaborate during the Q&A. The question of Russia and European security, the war in Ukraine, which I think is a great threat to the United States, primarily because it detracts from the US ability to shoot resources to Asia, which is something that not just President Trump, but also President Obama before him wanted to do. And moreover, the Chinese-Russian alliance is making it more difficult for the United States to navigate both in Europe and in Asia, because now arguably the second and third largest powers are working with each other against us. And at this point, I'll let Jacob take over, and there we go. And then I'll come back after.
Okay. I'll be a little more inward focused, but I thought I would mention that somebody asked if I had a good joke about Signal and sharing national security secrets.
I didn't, but I tried.
Yeah, you tried. I couldn't come up with one either, but I'll add you all to the chat once I come up with something. So my big question over my career has been when and how does U.S. grand strategy change? There's this constant kind of discussion of, does grand strategy kind of flip and turn with every new administration? Is it kind of flowing in broad waves? Can we expect, Obama got into office and said, I'm going to be totally different because of who I am. Trump got into office and said, I'm going to be totally different, and yet it feels like it doesn't shift too much. But I think Trump, too, really raises this question in new ways that we haven't looked at before. We haven't really, and under conditions we haven't seen before. A lot of that is tied to domestic politics. Now, I got started on this question looking at the response to 9/11. A lot of folks looked at the George W. Bush administration and saw their response to 9/11 and said, this is a dramatic break with everything the U.S. has done since World War II. That always struck me as a little overstated. We weren't leaving international institutions. He was still talking about human rights and democracy. A lot of the basic markers of American priorities in the world, integrated trade system and so forth. So it struck me that U.S. grand strategy seemed to continue to be stable within that framework that the U.S. established after World War II. So the question I'm thinking about now is, are we at a real changing point with Trump 2 in the White House, and really a Trump era upon us? Because between being elected in 2015 to now, or when he leaves office, presumably in 4 years, it'll be 12 years, right, of a Trump era. So, yeah, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. So the thing that most Americans tend not to think about is what scholars call the liberal international order, and we're at the center of that order. This is defined by a number of characteristics, but I want to tell you a story defined by 2 quotes. The first one here is, the world doesn't organize itself. This is from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken back in 2021. He would use this phrase periodically early in the Biden administration. Now, what did he mean by this? What he was referring to in particular was the U.S. order that was established after World War II, and he was saying there's only really one state in the world that can make sure that order stays in place. Now, why do we care about an international order? Well, implied in Blinken's argument here was that we care about this because we don't want to live in a chaotic world like the 1920s and 30s that led to catastrophic war. We've seen different iterations of this argument. How do we achieve stability in an unstable world with, as scholars like to call it, anarchy, no overarching authority? So there are different debates about this. One, and I think Dr. Popescu will be talking about, is a more realist approach, balance of powers and so forth. Blinken is talking about what we call liberal internationalism, and it's defined by these kind of characteristics, where the United States is the dominant military power in order to enforce its prerogatives and priorities. It also maintains a credible threat, meaning it's willing to go to war or start fights in different places, which is why over the decades Americans have grown increasingly skeptical and weary about interventionism. Why do we have to be the world police? Well, a lot of it traces back to this arrangement that the Americans established in the 1940s in order to avoid another kind of catastrophic conflict. Trade integration, really in the headlines today, is a key piece of this. The more we're integrated, the less runs the logic, the less likely we are to go to war with one another, and it benefits Americans, is the theory. We're interested in democracies versus autocracies. Again, in theory, that's often violated in different forms, but that's the premise of political relations. We're focused on building relations through institutions and organizations. The U.S. has global interests in this environment, and the key thing here is that it's acting as a leader. Finally, one of the key elements is this idea of universal values or universal rules, that we care about democracy, human rights, freedom, free trade. A lot of this is rhetoric, but it also, when push comes to shove, would guide a lot of investments that the U.S. was making in alliances, partnerships that it was developing. So Blinken is making the case that that was good, and it's really the only serious option. And the Trump administration, he thought, had been a break from that approach. Can you go to the next? So the other quote here is from Donald Trump. "I am a nationalist," he says. This was in probably 2017, 2018. After a couple of years in office, he's going to some rallies, and in one of them he says, people talk about internationalism. I'm more of a nationalist. You can use that word. I am a nationalist. Now, this was notable because a couple of years prior, in an interview, he said, I'm a little bit of an internationalist. I'm a little bit of a nationalist. Well, we'll see. Now, this was partly because he had two different types of groups in his administration, more conventional Republicans and some of the folks more kind of directly loyal to him and sharing his vision of the world. It's also notable because in an interview with a couple of New York Times reporters in 2016, they asked him, what do you think about America First? This was this movement in the 1930s, and you see an example here of a rally where a number of prominent Americans were saying, why should we care about issues in the old world? We should be America first, right? Prioritize our interests. Trump said, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I like that phrase. So the reporters said, this would be a terrible thing to associate with, because once World War II got started, this movement really died off. It was seen as kind of a failed movement. But Trump, with his political instincts, knew that a lot of Americans would like that idea, that approach, at least at that moment in history. So I'll get into more in a little more detail after I hand it back to Dr. Popescu about what this means and what it might entail for the United States. But I think a lot of this is reflected in a discussion I had with a colleague who retired years ago, 8 or 9 years ago. But he remembered this early period of formation, the U.S. role in the world, this liberal internationalism. But he said he thought of himself as a nationalist, that he, supported the United States first and foremost. But he could also remember a period when, I guess he was in kindergarten, there was this local women's group who was advocating for the UN. It was being formulated here in the late 1940s. And they came in with a UN flag in his classroom and hung it up right next to the American flag because everybody was optimistic for a new order in the world. And so he, in his mind, both of these things kind of flowed together, that nationalism and that internationalism. But nationalism has always existed as a separate and distinct strain in American foreign policy. So I'll hand it off to Dr. Popescu, and then we'll see what he says about his approach to the world, and then we'll come back and talk about what I think, where I think things are going with the Trump administration.
All right, thank you, Dr. Shively. And at this point, I will tell you in more detail about my book, and I think about what, in my understanding, the best American grand strategy that would most serve our interests. And then you can judge yourself whether the Trump administration, maybe Dr. Shively will have his views on that, whether it fits or not with this paradigm. And the way I started with is, as was mentioned before, from this idea of realism. So I'm a realist, and I wrote a book, the one behind, that outlines what I think a realist grand strategy would look like for our current era of great power competition. You will see that a lot of these issues are quite Trumpian in the way that they sound, but I wrote the book just based on the framework of realism. So sometimes Trump is acting like a realist, sometimes he's not. And to the extent that he is, I applaud it. To the extent that he is not, I deplore it. But at the end of the day, I think that, and I would hope that the more realist his actions are and the administration's actions are, the better the outcome will be for the United States. So realists believe in the importance of power, importance of national security, and most importantly, they argue that great powers, due to their economic and military strength, represent the top concerns for a country such as the United States, which is, of course, the prominent great power in the world. The title of the book, No Peer Rivals, in fact, is a short version of what realists believe the United States should aim for at this particular point in time, which is very basic. We are the largest, most powerful country in the world. We do not currently have a peer rival like we did during the Cold War, for example, with the Soviet Union. And therefore, our grand strategic framework should focus on keeping it that way. So we do not want another country to join us in the realm of superpowerdom. That's a very basic realist tenet. And from that particular analysis flows that the rise of China is the greatest threat, because China is the only country that has both the intentions and the capabilities of challenging the United States for this power, this position as the only superpower. And therefore, I argue in terms of the external security environment, the containment of China should be the main priority for American foreign policy and grand strategy. A second priority that I have there relates to maintaining our control of the Western Hemisphere, because of course, the way that a superpower maintains its status as a superpower is first and foremost controlling its own region, becoming the regional hegemon, and then once you are a regional hegemon, once you control your own area of the world, you can go ahead and make sure no other countries controls theirs. And I worry that in many ways, the US foreign policy took its eye off the ball in Latin America, Central America, in recent decades, and you see a lot of Chinese and Russians business interests, military capabilities that under the Monroe Doctrine would not be allowable. And I think that some actions of the Trump administration, if you think of the Panama Canal, and the way that already the US is pushing on the Panamanians to shift control of the canal from Chinese company to a consortium led by BlackRock, a US investment firm. I think that's very much in this realm. And of course, you have the border issues, which is tied in with more domestic security concerns. And that is not necessarily a question of grand strategy, except that the fentanyl that's coming through the border comes from China, and therefore I believe that the cartels, and I advocated in my book for them to be declared a terrorist organization so that we can be more aggressively pursuing the cartels, not only because they kill more Americans than any foreign power is through the fentanyl trafficking, but also because there are direct connections between the Chinese labs producing the fentanyl precursors and the Mexican cartels that are bringing it here. And the Chinese view that as a kind of chemical warfare in which they are able to attack indirectly the United States and keep our attention away from from their actions. So those two things are more connected than you may think. So in my list of priorities, like I said, a grand strategy should prioritize. We have two major concerns: China externally and the Western Hemisphere, including the border internally. And then what's not there, secondary priorities would be Russia and Eastern Europe, would be the Middle East, including Iran, and also the question of Israel-Palestine. And with that being said, in terms of priorities, let me talk a little bit about the means, because a strategy, in addition to goals and priorities, of course, also has the second half as what are the means and what are the ways in which you go about pursuing those two priorities. And here I have on the slide a couple of different sets of tools, and I think to the extent that Trump has a doctrine, it would be this combination of geopolitics and geoeconomics. More so than most other presidents, this administration believes that economic power, military power are intricately connected, not in the sense that a large economy allows us to buy more planes and more tanks, as many people do, but in the very direct way of arguing that the way our economic production is structured, particularly in terms of who makes the things that we are relying upon, particularly in terms of technology, is actually a national security concern. And, you know, you can think, if you're a younger person, of TikTok, that whole debate, and you can think, if you're not on TikTok, of things having to do with metal production, things having to do with aluminum, rare earths, any kind of industrial product that is going into, including high-end electronics that are going into our day-to-day life, that are made in China. And basically, the Trump administration, as most realists would, is skeptical that this is a good business model and that it's serving the U.S. national interests in the long run. So you have geopolitics, which are the questions of military and military planning and defense and alliances. And then you have the geoeconomics, which relate, and I have in my book separate chapters on industrial policy and trade, on the tech war, what, including the Chinese, call techno-nationalism. It's basically the idea that there are certain industries, and it is not just what you think of purely military ones, but even others that don't have an immediate military technology, but that nevertheless are seen as key for the future, AI being one of them, biotech companies, the entire EV, green energy sector, that are strategic by virtue of the fact that they will determine the shape of the global economy in the next 10 or 15 years, and the Chinese government is seeing those as national security concerns, basically, and they're investing, and they're doing a whole number of things that are not free market oriented, but they're oriented towards being able to control the supply chains with rare earths and a few other similar interventions directly in international markets, so that they establish their dominance in those industries, the solar panel being the most commonly widely known instance in which the Chinese basically bankrupted every non-Chinese company, and then of course they were the only ones producing those, and they literally would like to do that for electric cars and a few other areas which they list in a plan is not secret or anything, that they make it public that they have 10 industries in mind. It's called China 2050, in which they're going to push on. So I would like us to do the same, basically, and not to simply rely on free markets to counter the Chinese efforts in those areas. And then that means that I'm in favor of decoupling economically from China. I think that doesn't mean that we're not going to trade with them at all, but it means that we are not going to have this current relationship where we are basically running a huge trade deficit and they get to buy our debt and then sell us back products. I just don't think, and I've heard how crazy it would have been during the Cold War to have the US and the Soviet economy intricately related the way we have it with China. We never considered that would be a good idea, and yet in this particular situation, this strategic rivalry, the US has been much more willing to do business with China in a way that I think right now it's becoming detrimental to our national interest. And lastly, we have the energy realism. And by that, I mean that realists tend to argue that the country should use its resources in the best way that it gives its strategic advantages. And in the case of the United States, we're blessed with a lot of oil and gas, and therefore we should focus on maximally using that particular advantage in energy and not constrain ourselves for other reasons. I haven't heard much about climate change in the last 2 months, but I would assume that they're still out there somewhere, even if people don't talk about it. But the way to deal with climate change, I argue, is not to unilaterally try to reduce the amount of carbon emissions, because China is already emitting more carbon than we are, and they're not stopping. So if we can find a technology that would make it markedly efficient to move away from CO2 and fossil fuels, that will be great, and probably we will. But up until that time, I think it is a self-defeating policy to constrain or force our industry to standards that the Chinese and the Indians are not only because we're not fixing the climate, but we're also putting ourselves at a disadvantage relative to our peers. With that being said, I'll go back to Jacob.
All right, so I think I agree with Dr. Popescu on a lot of the issues confronting the U.S. and the geostrategic environment. Where we may differ is how likely the Trump administration, for example, will be to engage a realist, kind of coherent realist approach like you're describing. And I think part of the reason is this more nationalist bent, because the foreign policy or grand strategic approach that the administration has adopted is a little more inwardly driven rather than responding to the external environment. And as you can see here, I've got the two approaches kind of set next to each other. The strategic logic of internationalism is integration and cooperation for the sake of achieving international stability, like I suggested. And that also, in theory, protects American interests. This was the formulation that these American policymakers, diplomats in the 1940s were working with. This is a positive-sum vision of the world. In other words, the theory is everyone can gain. By contrast, the strategic logic of nationalism is more focused on self-sufficiency and hierarchy. In other words, there is a handful of great powers in the world, and they've got their followers, those who are close to them. Not quite, it's not allies in the internationalist sense. Rather, you're our partner, you kind of do what we say. And you see a little bit of that coming out already. So that's more of a hierarchical relationship. And so what you see are more zones of dominance between Russia, the U.S., China. This might be part of the reason the Trump administration is very skeptical of the Europeans. They seem like they're free riding on the Americans, and they should either be running their own zone of influence or following our lead and paying us for the privilege of doing it. So this is the kind of basic, it's a zero-sum view of the world. We have to get as much as we can, rather than the more positive sum vision. Now, Americans like to say, well, positive is better than zero, right? But that's not quite how a nationalist theory of international relations or grand strategy would hold it. Rather, the reality is, and this is where it overlaps a lot with realism, that's just how the world works. You'll be delusional if you if you cooperate too much, if you're helping others and you care about democracy too much at the expense of your own self-interest. So I want to give them a fair shake here. So this is defined by also by having a dominant military capability, but also a focus on wielding the big stick, as Teddy Roosevelt called it, rather than the credible threat. In other words, you reserve the right to use this capability and power where you see fit, but you don't feel the pressure to use it constantly. Maybe fewer interventions around the world, right? Trade nationalism as opposed to trade integration. This is happening in a big way right now, right? This is the logic of tariffs. What the Trump administration is thinking, or Trump himself anyway, is that if we need to break our existing trade relationships, get better deals, and draw in more of our production back within our borders, right? Complete opposite of the old internationalist view. More of an emphasis, like I said, on spheres of influence, bilateral ties, rather than institutions and organizations. Trump is even talking about taking Greenland and Panama. I don't know if this sounds a little bit like kind of neo-imperialism. And Trump has talked admiringly of President McKinley, who we see here, mostly for his tariff approach, but it's worth noting that I think these nationalists tend to look at the U.S. position in the world in the late 19th and early 20th century as a period of grandeur, right? The U.S. is growing and expansive, and they feel like we've given that up, right? Given up that ambition. So you're engaged in the world, but not constantly or relentlessly. You don't feel the pressure to be a global leader. And of course, rather than universal values, nationalists emphasize particular values, our local priorities, our local values. In a UN speech in his first term, Trump emphasized, look, you've got your sovereignty, we have ours. You should do your own thing, and we'll do our thing. So the approach is a familiar one to Americans, but among foreign policy elites, this type of thinking had really been anathema for many generations, partly because during the Cold War, even many conservatives were also anti-communists, and they were very interested and invested in being engaged in the world very actively, and they were skeptical of this more nationalist or inward-looking focus. But we can see in the 21st century, it clearly has a little bit more of an appeal. Can you go to the next slide? So the last thing I'll talk about here is how do we evaluate these approaches? So I've tried to present each one on its as its adherents would hold to them. How do we determine whether this is working, whether it's desirable? What I did in my most recent book, I was evaluating the Biden administration, and I distilled these basic categories from a lot of different scholars' approaches: process, quality, content, and outcomes. In other words, these are areas when scholars are trying to determine, or commentators, is this grand strategy working? Is it good? They'll point to these broad categories. So in process quality, for instance, is decision-making. Are they doing a good job evaluating their options? Are they following institutional processes that have been established over decades? These are these are not necessarily my recommendations. These are distilled from the kind of conventional wisdom of the scholarship. Now, on these, the Biden record was mixed, I would say, but it skewed toward following these categories because the Biden folks were more traditional foreign policy people. They were steeped in that internationalist tradition. Trump, by contrast, is kind of running directly at process, right? That is part of his appeal for a lot of people, is he's trying to break all of those. So if you're evaluating him on these categories, he doesn't come out too well, right, in terms of maybe the rational cost-benefit analysis, or following processes, certainly, right? They're cutting things rather than carefully following them. But he would also say, like, that's the point, right? Those processes weren't serving us well, and I'm going to break them up, and we'll see what coheres later. In terms of content, I will say he's much more consistent in this term than he was in the first term. In the first term, basically, Trump had appointed two sets of foreign policy advisors, right? More conventional Republicans, and his folks, like I had said, who were more kind of directly faithful to his vision. Over time, those more conventional folks fell away, and some of them characterized themselves as realists. And that's part of the reason I'll make the case that Trump is not really a realist, and the people around him probably aren't. I think they're probably more closely aligned with this vision, which looks similar but is different. So I think they're more consistent with their own vision in this term, right? And we'll see where that goes moving forward. But they certainly are feeling like they have the capacity, now that they're in office a second time, to really fulfill Trump's broad vision. And again, with tariffs in particular, he just has latched onto that as a useful tool. And then the last category would be outcomes. This is a little more vague, but basically what people are saying is, I don't care about their ideology, I don't care about do they do the process. Is America safer or not? Is it more prosperous or not? That's the measurement that I care about, right? So what are these categories? Do we or how do we measure these? This is particularly over just a few months. What you have to kind of do is project forward. What do you think is going to happen over coming months and years? Which is why we have these ongoing debates about, is this a good idea or not? Because we can't really know until afterwards. But as citizens and residents of the United States, we're really invested in these answers. So is the U.S. more secure under the Trump approach? I'll throw it out to you guys for all of us to think about in our discussion. But I will say overall on these categories, nationalism, if I'm right, if this is a nationalist approach, it comes with real trade-offs. So the benefit is that you have more autonomy, and you are more free to do your own, follow your own preferences. You have more of your own sovereignty, if you will. But the flip side is you may have alienated a lot of partners and allies. So if we're thinking about a confrontation with China, if you've been fighting with Canada, with Europeans, with Mexico, you don't have them at your back in the way you would have otherwise. So the nationalist trade-off is a pretty stark one. You are more free and more insulated from the rest of the world. Maybe you aren't making those overcommitments that you were in the past, but you have maybe less access to partners and allies like you would have previously. So I think the other argument I'll make here is that I think because the United States is the central actor in the world, and because we tend to be a capitalist actor, and we do care about democracy, I think we'll end up reinventing internationalism if it goes away. I think it's the sort of thing where it may be in remission. I think, to go back to the earlier question, is the Trump administration an epochal or generational change? I think it may be, simply because not only has he had a long time where he's influencing American politics, but a lot of his party is following along as well. They've shifted their rhetoric. A lot of those internationalist Republicans are using that language less, and they're using the language of nationalism more, I would say. So I do think it may be a lasting change, but my suspicion is that internationalism, like nationalism, won't quite go away. It's sort of, both of those are in our genes as Americans in American political culture. All right. So with that, I did, if you want to respond to anything I said, you're welcome to do that. But I think what we'll do is turn to questions. My understanding is that we have a couple of folks who will have microphones. So if you want to raise your hand, they will.
And
All right, we have our official first question, first of all, with Anthony. While they're getting ready, I wanted to, before we're done, thank Deb Zimmerman and Karen Tibbles, because they really made this whole thing possible. She's bringing water. Thank you.
Looks good.
thank you.
Thank you very much. Hey, everybody. So before I got into my question, I wanted to take a second to thank the audience, everybody sitting around me. They're all wonderful people. Thank you for being here. To the faculty, students, and all our guests that came out tonight, thank you for running on the support Department of Government. It's great things that they do here in Flash. You can come together to discuss things that affect all of us and our nation as a whole. With that, I want to get into our question, mainly for you, Dr. Popescu, but I'm sure Dr. Shively, you may want to weigh in on this as well. So what I wanted to ask that you talk about Trump's policies and its potential to transform the U.S.'s foreign strategy into a realist approach that you said. Like, as we've seen it, I kind of want to ask about concept about then pursuing a realist approach under Trump with the actions he's done so far. They distance ourselves from our allies like the EU. And you also mentioned decoupling from China. But what I want to ask is that, will these actions hurt us more than they benefit us? So are the benefits of pursuing an offensive realist stance, do those outweigh the costs of abandoning our current liberal international?
Thank you for the question. And yes, absolutely they do. And I'm going to start with Lord Palmerston, one of the classical thinkers of realism. And one of his most famous quotes was that Britain doesn't have permanent friends or permanent enemies. It only has permanent interests. I think that's true about the United States as well. If you think of World War II, we were allied with Stalinist communist Russia to fight Nazi Germany. Then we became enemies with Russia shortly thereafter. The French, very complicated history with them as well, mostly allies, but now if they're choosing, and the Europeans, by and large, the Western Europeans, to turn against the United States, that's perfectly normal. This is what great powers do. They go through trying to advance their own interests, and should the Europeans decide that their interests no longer align with ours, I don't think that that's anything abnormal, and in fact, it might allow us to finally move away from defending them, we did for 70 years, and focus on our own interest in China and in the Western Hemisphere. So I would welcome that shift. And realists have been skeptical of NATO, including the founding father of NATO in many ways, George Kennan. After the Cold War ended, he didn't see really a point in having the alliance in its current form, and he definitely did not see the point of extending it in the way that it was extended. And very briefly, also in terms of what Dr. Shively was mentioning earlier about the cost of nationalism, I would argue that those need to be compared not necessarily to having no costs, but to the cost of a different policy like liberal internationalism that we've been following, which I think were disastrous. And most realists opposed the war in Iraq. They opposed the nation-building process in Afghanistan, and they opposed the extension of NATO, which arguably led to the current conflict in Europe. So the other grand strategies had, I would argue, a lot higher costs for fewer benefits, at the very least since the end of the Cold War. So I do welcome this change. I think the benefits far outweigh the costs. But
Okay. One
not agreeing.
point of clarification, we're probably talking about three different approaches here. Realism, as you're defining it, liberal internationalism, and nationalism. And I'm kind of beating the drum of nationalism, not necessarily as a nationalist, but I think that as a concept has really fallen off the radar in our discourse. I think it's a helpful term, helpful concept.
I think for me, it's like French vanilla versus Mexican vanilla, like nationalism and realism. They're like 90% the same. I never know exactly what. I will tell you one difference, though, if you're curious, and that gets to a very nuanced thing. But realists, for example, would want the production out of China to go anywhere that's not a Chinese ally. So if companies shift from China to, say, Indonesia or Mexico, that's good enough. Nationalists would want the production to come into the United States. And that could be one of those nuanced differences where the Trump administration is more nationalist than realist. And there are a few others, but like size of the defense budget, I think realists would focus more on maintaining a large military. Nationalists may worry with good reason about national debt and may be willing to cut the defense budget, even if it may hurt the strategic perspective, because it would help with domestic priorities or shift money from defense towards domestic issues. So those could be like two small differences. But from the categories you had, I think that there's a lot more between nationalism and realism that's similar compared to the liberal internationalism.
Mm-hmm. One thing I'll pick up, and then we'll go back to questions, is I'll disagree on the NATO argument, because you said it was made conflict more likely in Europe, and realists have always been very skeptical of it. And that's a very plausible argument. So I'll make the case, though, that actually NATO is a good investment, and if we're talking about cost-benefit analysis, because it's a relatively modest investment for the United States, but keeps those countries in its orbit very tightly in terms of military command structure and so forth. And it does act as a deterrent, right? It's easy to imagine Russia attacking Ukraine, but not Estonia, at least a few years ago. So because of NATO. So I'll make the case that that's a good example where realists do make a strong case, but I think they're getting the calculation wrong in my estimation. So there are two different views. All right, other questions?
Yeah, with this whole thing about Europe kind of coming up on the whole and doing their own thing, since they're starting to move more away from the U.S. and starting to look more towards China in that whole idea, why is it better that they kind of decouple away from the U.S., even though it's going towards what our true enemy is right now, which is China, and how they're basically being able to swoop in behind the U.S. and have their own viewpoints be pushed out more towards the world rather than the U.S. interests.
So you're saying Europe has been drifting more toward China in terms of its...
Getting more military, they are getting more economic boosts and more energy boosts from China rather than the U.S.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if you're talking about Western or Eastern Europe as far as getting closer to China. Can you clarify? Okay, so if it's Western Europe, I do not think that they're getting Chinese military cooperation or anything. And in fact, I would argue that the economic relations are getting worse because the Chinese domestic car industries, BYD and a few others, particularly on the electric side, are outcompeting the traditionally, the German cars, the French, Italian car companies, and there are a lot of economic tensions between them that are only going to get worse as the Chinese electric industry is going to come into Europe, and their economic model used to be that they will export to China and then they will benefit from U.S. protection. And now they're neither exporting to China as much nor they're benefiting from U.S. protection. So they're in a lot of trouble. And I do not think that they will in any way become allies with China because they have not only the Chinese do not like European Union's liberal democratic values, but nor do the Europeans truly have anything to gain from, like you mentioned, military cooperation. It's not as if, who would China defend them from? Russia? I mean, China and Russia are best friends right now and allies. So if the Europeans are honest about actually fearing Russia, which I don't think that they are, and I don't think they really imagine Russia invading Estonia, because if they were, they would act a little differently. But even if they were, it's not China that they would go to. They would just do more things to get us to help them or defend themselves, which is what realists would predict, that they would start rearming and actually be more serious about defending themselves. After all, they do have large economies. They just choose not to invest in military force.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. It's easy to kind of overstate Europeans kind of connecting with the Chinese, but partly because they were groping around, well, partly because they started to feel like the U.S. was maybe not a reliable trade partner in some cases, or they were looking for cheap goods. The classic example was Huawei, where they were buying Huawei goods, and then the Americans said, this is a terrible idea, we don't want you to do it, and eventually the Europeans, by hook and by crook, decided that, yeah, well, we agree, we won't do that. So, but I think what is interesting to see is moving forward, they are kind of in a real over a barrel here, because they're losing a lot of U.S. support. But after the Russia invasion, they're realizing that they can't look east either to Russia or to China as like a reliable economic partner either.
This one's simply productifying what else I've called inequality. When you talk about the international relations and the strength of the relationship around the common administrations, yeah, we are allies. Like Canada, Mexico specifically, to our neighbors. We look at the war in the Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan, there were a lot of restrictions put on our allies, whether for example, Poland couldn't operate in kinetic operations alongside U.S. forces, and Canada was a voluntary force altogether. So anybody who was there, they were there of their own accord. It wasn't through military, but it wasn't through government orders. That said, how likely do you consider our allies for Mexico and Canada and international partners, if we ever did get into kinetic conflict with China, actually participating in that to the fullest extent? Or do you consider that maybe the participation is going to be that is where they go there more in spirit, more in logistics, and not really fighting alongside?
Well, it partly depends on the conditions of the war, but yeah, I think you're right. On balance, they would probably be more of the latter, right? More symbolic. But some of them, like Australia, would probably be much more supportive of the U.S. I mean, it's out of their region. The U.S. is a Pacific power, so in that case, they would kind of beg off. It's notable that they did spend a lot of time in Afghanistan, and they really didn't have to, but they wanted to support the U.S. But you're right. I think realists have the phrase "passing the buck," or something like. Right, they'll definitely try to get the U.S. to do all the work and back off as much as they can. But the closer a given conflict is to their own borders, the more likely they are to be more directly engaged. But the other issue, and Trump and a lot of other presidents are right, they were free riding on U.S. military power for a long time and weren't developing their capabilities. So when they did want to, bomb Libya or something like that, they just weren't there, even when they were willing. So, it's a fair critique. And the Americans have not been able to figure out how to get them to stand on their own. And the Telegram thread, right, kind of reflected that, or not Telegram, Signal thread kind of reflected that.
I did a follow-up, though. It wasn't particularly about that. Like, talk about plan strategy on smart military applications and nationalism and about security. But there's a lot of first-hand accounts as far as propaganda war that contributed to fall the Soviet bloc with the Tsar and that. How do you consider your propaganda in play? And do you think that it's even worth investing in the generation of warfare?
doing it.
Yeah, I think information warfare, as they call it, is important to keep in mind that other countries are trying to run information operations on us, like we try to run information operations on them, and partly could be disinformation operations, partly could be cyber attacks and other things that have been around for a while. I don't know that I buy the idea that it will be more relevant in the future than in the past, because with the explosion of information and with AI and the flood of various news sources, it's almost impossible to have one narrative. So you will have contested narratives, and you can fight for your own narrative to do better. Whether I believe the US government is competent at that, no, but I don't think other governments are necessarily the best at doing it either. It's truly the private companies that seem to be, and they happen to be American, which is great for us in most ways. All of the tech platforms in the West, at least, are not in China. China has its own, and we can operate in Russia after Ukraine. So unfortunately, we do not have that kind of ability to do it like we did during the Cold War. But I think that, yes, it is a threat, but also, just like we don't have a great ability to operate in theirs, their ability to truly influence, I think, our own domestic discourse is also very limited because of the amount of sources out there.
Maybe we'll move on just to give other people.
You had young lady.
So there are people that got the Trump relies on to that are very big billionaires that have companies that can use a lot of, like, instead of having people that work here only go to China to get the stuff, labor and province. Can you talk about how that might affect this realism approach, and why you have think that this will still work, or what may be the drawbacks of these people's unlimited power on the president at this point?
I can talk a little bit first. Yes, great question. And truly the biggest obstacle in most ways to implementing realism is the influence of Wall Street. And that's been something that's been going on for at least 20 or 30 years in terms of China, that our policy was determined by our business economic interests, not by our national security kind of realist concerns. And that was true during both Republicans and Democratic administrations. And therefore, when people who care more about national security or grand strategy, like myself, argue, for example, to decouple from China, their biggest enemies are the companies that rely on China, which tend to be a lot of the companies you're thinking of, and I would assume you're thinking of Tesla maybe. They make their cars there, Amazon, right? All of them, truthfully, do it. There are very few at the large cap, the mega cap companies that do not have close integration with China. Like Meta doesn't, because they cannot operate there. Google doesn't, again, they cannot operate there. Not that they wouldn't want to, but they are just not allowed to. So that's gonna be, but all the financial companies do it, of course. All of the big banks have major operations with China. So it will be a fight for the president's ear, in a sense, between the more Wall Street people, like you were mentioning to some extent, the more internationalist ones, and the ones that are more nationalist and would rather take some, I think that the Treasurer, the Secretary, had a very interesting point, even though he's more of a Wall Street person, Scott Bessent, but he did say that there's more to life than having cheap-made Chinese goods. So that was a very big deal, I think, because it's rare that you see someone in his position actually saying that if we pay a little more for our own products, but we make them here, that might be closer to the American dream than just having cheap crap coming from China all the time. But that's just my view.
Yeah, just a couple of things to add to that in terms of maybe context. One is that the U.S. economic integration with China is in some ways a failed strategic experiment where the Clinton administration, well, two things: they thought it was impossible to ignore the Chinese economy and we would be smart to link up to it because a lot of rich billionaires or corporate CEOs and so forth said, you know, if I can just sell one toothbrush to every person in China, I'll be set, right? We just need some access, and that'll be good for Americans, right? So what the theory was, the more integrated they are and the more their economy increases, the more likely you'll see pressure to open up as increasingly as like a free society, pressure for
they're going to
democracy.
become democracy like us.
Yeah.
Because wealthy people like that.
Yeah. So build up a middle class, and people will demand more freedom. But they got the development, but the political reform never quite happened. So that's part of what's going on, right? And at the same time, American manufacturing was declining, not just because of this, but that was a part of it, right? So it became a political issue domestically. But I think, to link up with something you were saying, this is, today, it's a wedge issue, as political scientists say. I mean, among business folks, some want an open and accessible and stable international order, and others are more interested in developing the U.S. more internally. So we may see more cracks in that, billionaire face that you were talking about.
Whether the strategies are grand or otherwise to account, they're expensive. We're next in deep debt. We're troublesome debt, and I don't foresee a bright line to doing away with that debt. Are there any domestic strategies we should be talking about in terms of being able to ultimately come up with cash to pay for these international needs?
So that's a tough one because it's a kind of interrelationship between your investments overseas and maintaining this kind of global international stability, because we have a lot of economic integration. It's a kind of long-term investment to spend on the military in particular. That's probably the most expensive element of our international investment. But probably the hidden one is economic integration that leads to manufacturing leaving U.S. shores and that sort of thing. Again, not all of that, all U.S. Manufacturing decline can be ascribed to that, but some portion of it. So that's a kind of hidden cost. The Trump approach is let's shock all of those trade relationships, and that will allow us to rebuild our domestic economic productivity. But that I'm not sure. I see all the downsides of that approach because it hasn't really been tried before in a serious way, like in the modern era. So I don't see a path forward for that. But I'm not an economist, so I don't know.
Well, neither am I. But I do have something to say about that, because I think it is definitely a unsustainable situation for our debt to reach the 33 trillion right now. It's really hard to keep track, but I did hear recently Neil Ferguson, who is a well-known historian, British historian. He made the point that no great power that paid more in interest than on military spending continued to be a great power much longer, and the U.S. just for the first time this year crossed that. So as big as the $1 trillion in defense spending is, we pay more on just the interest on the debt than we pay on defense spending, and that's not sustainable. My strategy would arguably be able to reduce some of the spending on defense by shifting away from those areas like Europe, like I mentioned, like the Middle East, and use those resources more sparsely towards just focusing on China and the Western Hemisphere. And particularly because military operations are very costly, and we have had a lot of operations in the Middle East for the last 20 years or so for not much strategic gain that I can see. And even with this stupid signal thing, if you actually look through some of the messages, some of the more interesting ones were, to my eyes at least, those from J.D. Vance pushing back and arguing that for good reason, the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, which were bombing the Houthis, is where the Chinese sent stuff to Europe. So yes, part of the global economy, we're keeping it open, but the U.S. trade in there, it's not really what we're keeping open. We're helping the Chinese. And yes, there are connections, and some of our firms may be involved. And the answer from the military was, now that we can all read it, that yes, but the Europeans, they cannot do it. They just don't have the ability to bomb the Houthis, apparently. Because the Houthis, that's what the signal channels are saying, have military technology that's better at defending like anti-air systems that the European just cannot do by themselves. So we had to do it for them and the international community, I suppose. Not that we get any credit for that also, but that's exactly why I think that those kind of things should not necessarily happen, and they will allow us to save some money because, you know, those weapons that we used can get very, very expensive.
Can I do a follow-up? I think when the first you alluded to this, I felt like for some time we were sort of deprecating the Caribbean Basin, Central America, Latin America. If you fly to Atlanta, Quito now, you see miles of oil derricks, and they're managed and operated by Spain, but they're funded by China. And when it comes to the South American alliances, we barely have to see that. It's not a potential.
You know, that's why I'm saying we have nation building here at home. We don't have to go there to the Middle East to do it if we do want to be more involved in that.
Yeah, on that particular thing, I'll only add, for years I've always wondered why the U.S. was not more engaged in Latin America in that way. Probably part of the history has made Latin American countries skeptical of the U.S., but they have traditionally been willing to work with the U.S. on, collegial terms. So yeah, it's been a curious oversight of U.S. administrations over the years.
Good evening. Dr. Ramsey, it's encouraged for being here, and this question was for whether it.
With the rate of technological advancement exponentially increasing, with rapid advancements in disruptive technology in both the classified and the civilian sectors, in your opinion, do you think a breakthrough technological event can necessitate America to adopt offensive realism, or perhaps even go to war? And what sector would you predict this could occur?
So could a new technology drive the U.S. to more aggressive posture with an adversarial state? It's hard to, the Soviets always complained about the Americans getting like a new missile defense system, because they said that would be the type of technology that would create that kind of a situation. So it's hard for me to think of something today that is on the horizon that might create that. But, maybe the use of a certain type of technology, AI, like automated drones or something like that are actively attacking shipping throughout the Pacific or in the South China Sea, kind of an indiscriminate use of one of these new technologies might tip Americans over into feeling like they're being actively attacked and respond accordingly.
I think another way in which breakthrough technologies could mean a lot of trouble is, and you're already seeing some of it, creating large vulnerabilities for legacy systems. So yes, you could have AI-enabled drones overwhelm the defenses of an aircraft carrier much easier than you could have imagined before. you could have cyber attacks really paralyze some of our military weapon systems, and that might lead to a revolution in military affairs that, unlike the previous ones, would not lead to the U.S. coming up on top. It might actually allow others to catch up much faster than. And the Chinese, the Russians, they know that they will not match us in the number of aircraft carriers or even in the sophistication of our fighter jets or the quality of our men and women. We're better educated, better trained in many ways than they are. However, they can absolutely match us in terms of cyber, drone, AI, things that are cheap. They can be made at scale. They're not super secret in any meaningful way. Like you can buy a lot of them even commercially. So that would allow them to really even the playing field in a way that could spell trouble, because it could give them the confidence, perhaps misplaced confidence, but confidence nevertheless, that they could actually win, let's say, a war with the United States over Taiwan, or that they could push us out of the South China Sea should they be able to threaten our ships. And, they don't have to sink all of them. They sink one, make their point, then it'll be a very tough call for the U.S. leaders, whether they still want to maintain our presence in Asia or not, if you see an aircraft carrier go down.
So the challenge is the technology emboldening like China.
Yeah, I think the way technology works right now is going more in their favor than ours, just because they are the underdog, and if they can get that next level technology first, they would be able to skip ahead, and we would have all of these legacy systems that were great for 50, 60 years, but may not be as good in the next 50.
All right, I think we're about out of time, so we maybe if we've got a short question.
Here had a question for a while. Can we take one last question? Or I'm not in charge of the microphones, but I did see you.
You have no power.
A little bit.
Given the rise of increasing security concerns, both domestically and internationally, to what extent do you both believe that transnational criminal organizations will affect great power competition? And then after that, what is the potential threat assessment of TCO actions on the global order?
Well, I already talked about the cartels. I think they're very, very bad people, as President Trump would say, and they can also impact the U.S. national security in a very direct way, because they're literally killing Americans, and what's more national security than that? So it's going to more.
Yeah, I think that's accurate, but if we're thinking in terms of like an existential national security threat, I don't think they'll rise quite to that level. Similar, partly because the motivation of those types of organizations is to be parasitic on the system rather than knock it down. Now, in prior eras, you might have warlords or organized criminals that take over entire political systems, right? But the U.S. isn't not under that kind of a threat. I could imagine, maybe some states falling into that kind of a situation, and then like in Afghanistan or Somalia, some kind of issue metastasizing there. But in general, those types of organizations tend to get their heads chopped if they get a little too big for their britches, because most other governments, whatever their other differences, don't want to see that get out of hand, unless we're talking, the fentanyl thing into Mexico, or opium in China in the 19th century, right? So I wouldn't rule it out, but typically they tend to get, they're not motivated to stick their necks out. And my favorite example is the Colonial Pipeline was shut down, and the cyber ransom group texted out basically, we didn't mean to create a national security incident, we just want money, right? So don't come after us was sort of their thing. So it's a good example of the limitations on that particular threat. All right, well, I think we're out of time. I've never seen so many of my books in one place. That might be true for you too.
I've never seen them, period.
It's the first time for these. So if you're interested in one or both, feel free to come on up, and we'll happily. You don't have to. We won't sign it if you don't want to, but we're happy to do that too. So anyway, I don't know if you guys have. So
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, you've all been a wonderful audience. Thank you for coming out tonight.